This is why you should never walk alone in the woods. Do you like walking in the woods? Write in comments. The Boy Who Lost His Face is a scary story about a boy who went camping on the island and wandered off the trails. There is a summer camp on Satellite Island called Camp Orkila. Every summer, groups of children go out to the island for overnight trips. The campers stay there for a few nights and go hiking and explore the island. There are a lot of tall cliffs and the trails run along the edge of the cliffs. One summer a group of campers went out on a trip to Satellite Island. One of the campers was a 7-year-old boy named Johnny. He was a bit of a loner and didn't mix well with the other kids. He liked to wander off on his own and the counselors constantly had to keep an eye on him. On the first day, after they built camp, the counselors took the kids for a long hike on the trails around the perimeter of the island. Halfway through the hike, Johnny wandered off from the group and nobody could find him. They doubled back and searched the trail, but there was no sign of him. The sun was setting and counselors had to take the kids back to camp before it got dark. Later that night, the counselors were about to go to bed when they saw Johnny come walking down from the trails. They were relieved that they weren't going to have to report a missing child, but they were also angry that he had ignored their warnings and wandered off from the group. The next day, as punishment, Johnny wasn't allowed to leave the campsite. He had to stay behind while the others went to explore the island. On the third day, Johnny begged to be allowed to go hiking again and explore the rest of the island. The counselors reluctantly decided to let him go with them again on the hike, but they warned him not to wander off on his own. However, while the kids were exploring the inner part of the island, Johnny disappeared again. The counselors searched for him, but the island is quite large and they weren't able to find him. Eventually, the sun began to set and they were worried that if they stayed out after dark, they might run the risk of getting lost themselves. So the counselors had to take the other kids and make their way back to the main campsite, leaving Johnny alone in the woods again. They all assumed Johnny would come back on his own again. But that night, as they were going to bed, there was still no sign of Johnny. When they woke up in the morning, the wayward boy was still missing, so the counselors organized a search party. They searched the woods and the trails, but they couldn't find him anywhere. They combed every inch of the island, shaking trees, looking in caves and peering into crevices, but they still couldn't find any trace of him. One of the counselors was walking along the trail that led along the cliffs when he happened to peer over the edge. All of a sudden, he spotted something in the water that sent a chill down his spine. It looked like a bundle of clothes being pushed by the tide up and down along the rocks at the base of the cliffs. The other counselors piled into a small boat and rowed out to the location. As they got closer, they could see that it was the body of a young boy, floating face down in the water. They recognized his clothes. It was Johnny. One counselor reached out and grabbed the boy by the scruff of the neck. As he tried to pull the body onto the boat, the small corpse flipped over and the counselor let out a horrified scream. Everybody on the boat saw Johnny's face, or what was left of it. The grisly sight made them vomit over the side. Johnny's face was gone, scraped off by the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff. There was nothing left but torn up flesh and a pair of eyes, cold dead eyes, wide open and staring at them. They had to call the Coast Guard to come take the body. Johnny's parents were overcome with grief. Ever since then, they say the ghost of Johnny haunts Satellite Island. They call him Johnny No Face. If you're on the island at night, it is said that you can see his eyes, just a pair of cold, dead eyes, staring at you from the trees, silently watching you. They say if you wander off into the woods alone, you may come across a young boy with brown hair standing with his back to you. If you see him, whatever you do, don't speak to him. If you talk to him, they say, he will turn around and rip off your face. The strangling hands. The phantom hands clamped around the child's face, and the room was filled with the chill of death. William Bales, standing over his daughter's cot, could see the dents in her flesh made by the force of the invisible fingers. William Bales and his family had for weeks been terrorized by a presence they called it, a malignant being that had transformed their cottage near West Auckland, in England's County Durham, into a house of fear. During the spring of 1953, it first arrived at the cottage, where Mr. Bales, a 40-year-old garage owner, lived with his wife and young daughter. First, it lurked outside. "We heard a shuffling out in the garden," Mr. Bales later told investigators. This occurred for some nights, and then gradually the thing seemed to nose its way into the house and become mixed up with our lives. The Baleses were not easily frightened, but the presence that infiltrated their home filled them with bewilderment, and finally, with terror. Eventually, the presence made itself felt every night. The family couldn't sleep. Furniture was moved, clothes and books disturbed. One night, Mr. Bales's wife Lottie was grabbed by unseen hands and pulled across the room. Often when the family retired for the night, they found the beds were warm as though something had already been lying on them. The family cat refused to remain in the house at night. Mysterious knocks and clatters disturbed even the most sound sleeper. The final horror came one night when their young daughter, Doreen, was asleep on her cot in her parents' room. Mr. Bales later described in detail a scene he would never forget. "First we felt it arrive in the usual way. Everything became chilled and there was a peculiar odor, the smell of a decaying jungle. Then I noticed that Doreen had begun to struggle in her sleep. As we watched, one of Doreen's eyes was forced open and then the other. It was as if someone was forcing them open with a thumb and forefinger. We could see the marks of the fingers on her skin. Lottie and I clung to each other, terrified. Then I forced myself to go over to the cot and pry the hands away. I am sure they meant to murder the child. I swept my fist over Doreen's face and at once her head fell back onto the pillow, her eyes closed, and her skin resumed its natural folds. But there was no sleep for Lottie and William Bales that night. As the dawn was breaking, they vowed that they had suffered enough. If the thing wanted them to leave their home, they would. By now, the haunted cottage had become famous. A group of psychic investigators, intrigued by the reports, asked whether they could spend a few days at the place. The Bales family agreed. They had already found a new home and wanted nothing more to do with the cottage. In June 1953, two men, equipped with tape recorders and infrared cameras, installed themselves in the haunted room. They locked the door and waited. A report compiled the next day reads as follows: "We both fell asleep but were awakened by the sound of something soft plopping about on the floor outside the door. There was a silence and then a pawing sound at the bottom of the door. We opened the door and dashed out onto the landing. Our flashlights revealed a curious green haze which drifted eerily near the ceiling. We were conscious of a horrible smell, a smell of decay and rottenness. We returned to the room and locked the door. We both had the impression that someone or something was on watch outside the door the whole night. With the first light, the gaseous smell disappeared and the fumbling sounds went away. This convinced us that the watcher on our threshold was a creature of darkness and could not face the clean morning air." The investigators left the cottage none the wiser, leaving an archaeologist to advance the most reasonable explanations of it. He suggested that the cottage was built over an ancient well that, under certain conditions, gave out a pungent gas that drifted through the floor of the cottage. As it moved, it disturbed the foundations, creating both the smell and the noises. But why did they disappear at dawn? How do you explain the episode of the phantom hands? How were furniture and belongings physically moved? These are questions no one can answer. The tale of it will remain a classic example of the inexplicable, stranger, indeed, than fiction. The Beast is a scary story about one tired man. One night, a man was driving down a lonely country road when his car broke down. He got out and started walking, hoping that a passing car might stop and pick him up. The rain began and quickly became a downpour. The wind was blowing hard and it swept the rain into his face. He staggered on through the mud, looking for somewhere he could take shelter. Eventually, he came to an old, crooked house set back from the road, between two small hills. The walls were a pale, sickly gray, and it had a thatched roof. The windows looked like wild, staring eyes, and the front door looked like a grinning mouth. "Hello," he yelled. "Is there anybody there?" The curtains in the window shifted in the breeze, but there was no answer. He banged his fist on the front door, and to his surprise, it creaked open. Cautiously, the man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His clothes were drenched and he was soaked to the bone. The interior of the house was dark and he strained his eyes to see in the dim light. The air seemed heavy and there was a stench of mold and decay. There was no furniture, just a bare room. The floor was covered by a shabby brown carpet and some white sticks were strewn around. The walls were strangely curved, like a cave, and they were covered in green slime. He took a box of matches out of his pocket, struck one and held it up. When he reached out and touched one wall, it felt cold and clammy and squishy, like raw meat. He backed away, still holding the match, and his foot kicked something on the floor. When he looked down, he saw that it was something round and white. To his horror, he realized it was a human skull, staring up at him with two shadowy eyes. On the ground nearby, there was another skull, and over in the corner lay yet one more. What he thought were white sticks strewn around on the floor were actually bones, arm bones, leg bones, and rib bones. What he thought was a carpet was really just shaggy, bristly hair. Just then, the match burned down to his fingertips and he dropped it. The darkness closed in around him again. Shaking with fear, the man lit another match and turned to leave, but he couldn't see the door. He felt along the cold, slimy walls, but he couldn't find it. On the back wall, there was a small hole, and as he watched, it seemed to grow larger. He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. His mind clung to logic like a man in a hurricane clings to a tree, desperately trying to stop himself from being blown away. "Where am I?" he gasped. "What's going on?" A sour, sickly smell filled the air and he felt water rising around his ankles. When he looked down, he saw it wasn't water but some type of slimy, sticky liquid with bubbles in it, almost like saliva. He began to panic, sloshing back and forth through the sludge, trying to find a way out. "It's as if it's not a house at all," he exclaimed. "It's the belly of a beast." All of a sudden, the walls started stretching like elastic, closing in on him. The carpet beneath his feet began to ripple and roll, like a giant tongue. It lifted up in the air, tossing him back and forth like a rag doll. It tossed him back towards the hole in the wall, which opened like a huge throat and swallowed him whole. Then, he was falling, and the last thought that passed through his mind before he lost consciousness was, "The house is eating me alive." Evil on the cliffs. The chalk cliffs of Beachy Head tower nearly 600 feet above the grey water of the English Channel. It is the loftiest headland in southern England, a lonely spot in Sussex in which few people care to loiter, for Beachy Head has a grim history and a macabre reputation. High among the chalk crags, where the wind always howls even on the balmiest summer day, dwells the most malevolent spirit in Britain. It is an evil influence that, during the past 20 years it is claimed, has hurled more than 100 victims over the edge to death on the cruel wave-lashed rocks below. Many have stated positively, some under oath, that they felt this evil influence on the cliffs and had to violently combat a power attempting to force them over the edge to their doom. Few can stand near the edge of Beachy Head without being aware that some almost hypnotic power lurks in its towering cliffs. A few years ago, a young girl stumbled back hysterically from the head and up to a patrolling policeman. She said that while she was resting on the cliffs, a cold shadow suddenly descended around her. She felt herself in a strange, dank atmosphere even though the sun was shining brightly at the time. She got up and began to run, and some huge menacing form seemed to follow me, driving me toward the edge of the cliffs. Screaming for help, she turned and ran away from the cliffs to safety. In 1952, about 100 people accompanied medium Ray DeVicki to the top of Beachy Head on a wild night in February. By the light of pressure lamps, they gathered to try to contact the spirits of some of the people who had committed suicide there. But then, in a macabre scene unprecedented in occult research, the medium was suddenly attacked by a presence that urged him to jump over the cliff himself. Deviki said afterward that the spirit was fully visible to him. It was an elderly bearded man wearing an ankle-length robe like a monk's habit, with black markings on the back. It was in chains, said the medium. Not handcuffs, but ancient wrought iron shackles. I don't think anyone could have jumped from the cliffs in chains like that. I imagine it was the spirit of someone who had been bound and thrown from the cliffs centuries ago. The séance began in the ordinary way, with Deviki calling on the spirit to make some sign he could recognize. Suddenly he walked toward the edge of the cliff out of the light of the lamps. The watchers moved forward in alarm. They heard Deviki shout, "There is a voice calling, oh Helen. There is a George Foster being called. Then, Peggy Jordan destroyed herself here, there is a bearded man," Deviki continued, his voice rising above the wind. "He is evil. He is calling us a lot of blaspheming fools. He is saying he will sweep us all over." The medium began to laugh wildly. 4 men rushed forward to restrain him from hurling himself over the cliff edge. Apparently possessed, he struggled desperately with his rescuers. "This thing wants revenge," he shouted. "He wants his own back. He has lain in wait for years." His struggles became more violent, then suddenly Deviki went limp and was dragged back to safety. After the séance, Deviki explained, "This was the strongest influence I have ever encountered. I seemed impelled toward the cliff edge. The specter was of someone who was chained, perhaps the victim of a sacrifice, who has hated and wished ill to all ever since." A week later, the group again climbed the cliff and Deviki said prayers. This time nothing unusual happened. The medium said, "I think the unquiet spirit has been laid to rest forever." But has it? The spirit of Lindholm. During World War II, the Royal Air Force Station at Lindholm, England, was not your average fighter base, and British pilots were not the only airmen who flew deadly missions against vital targets in Germany. There were aviators from many nations based at Lindholm, but the most maniacal of the bunch were from the Polish Air Force. Polish flyers lived only to destroy German planes and cities to retaliate for the deaths and incarceration suffered by their families at the hands of the Nazi troops. The eager airmen would fly until they were ready to drop from fatigue, then take off as soon as they awoke from a few hours of sleep, refueled on hot coffee. One pilot from this highly driven crew perished in a fiery crash, but still would not quit. One evening in 1945, a Halifax was returning to Lindholm. The encounter had been successful for the enemy. German anti-aircraft gunners had severely damaged the heavy 4-engine bomber. But the plane was not the only victim of the attack. The pilot was seriously injured, bleeding from several wounds and barely managing to keep the airplane level as it approached the field. Time became another enemy. As the minutes ticked away, the wounded pilot was getting weaker. He found he was having increasing difficulty concentrating on what he knew would be the one chance to land the bomber. Then time ran out. Just as he saw the lights of the airfield, the pilot knew he could no longer maintain altitude. He decided to attempt the landing alone and ordered his crew to bail out. When the last crewman cleared the plane, the desperate pilot lined up with the runway. The plane hit the ground heavily and created a giant watery rooster tail as it began skidding. Whether it was because the brakes failed or the pilot lost consciousness, the huge bomber came to rest in a soggy bog. Moments later, it had completely disappeared, sunk into the marsh. The operations officer added the aircraft to his long list of casualty statistics, removed the dead pilot's name from the daily schedule, and the war continued. The Halifax was gone forever, but the valiant aviator refused to be taken off the duty roster. A few weeks after the tragic crash, the base chaplain was startled by an unusual sight. A pilot, wearing a ragged flight suit and bleeding profusely, suddenly appeared and asked for directions to the mess hall. The chaplain wanted to take the wounded airman to the dispensary, but the ghastly figure utterly vanished before he could speak. On another occasion, an officer was approached by a bloody flyer in a torn flight suit who asked for directions to the mess hall, then disappeared. The war ended, but the late Polish airman still continued with his unrelenting search for the Lindholm mess hall. The gruesome specter was seen for years, until local authorities decided to claim the bog for its peat deposits. A digging crew discovered the remains of the Halifax while clearing the marsh. The properties of the bog had preserved the bomber and its lone crewman. The pilot's body sat in the cockpit, dressed in the same ragged flight suit seen by so many at the airfield during the past 40 years. He was buried with full military honors and never seen again. The strangers who foretold death. One summer afternoon in the middle of the 1800s, a group of boys left St. Edmund's College, a well-known school about 40 miles north of London, for a boat ride. The outing, which began as a happy outing, was to end in grim tragedy. One of the boys, Philip Weld, was to die in a whirlpool in the River Lea, and by some mysterious and inexplicable process, his father, more than 200 miles away, was to learn of the death at that very moment from two strangers he met on the road. There were 15 boys in the group, and they left school shortly after lunch. At about 5 p.m., Philip was rowing a skiff containing 3 others when they decided to change places. A boy named Joseph Barron was to get his turn at the oars. Philip stood up and edged his way to the bow, while Joseph took his place. Suddenly, an unseen current seized the boat and swung it violently to the left. Philip clung to the side of the boat, lost his balance, and fell into the river. Cries of alarm turned to shouts of laughter as Philip reappeared. The water was only up to his waist. Joseph moved the boat over, and the other 2 boys prepared to drag Philip aboard. As they reached out, there was a swirl of water and a cry. Philip disappeared before their eyes. The alarm was raised and other boats arrived on the scene. They discovered that Weld had been standing on a thick shelf of clay that had given way under his weight and dragged him down to the river bottom. The teacher in charge sent the students home and contacted Dr. James Cox, the president of the college. Workmen with grappling hooks were called out, but they failed to locate the body. Although recovery operations went on until dark, nothing was found. The next day, a lock farther downstream was opened, and the movement of the water dislodged the body from its clay tomb. Dr. Cox did not return to St. Edmunds but traveled to London, and from there to Southampton, to tell Philip Weld's father of the tragedy personally. With a priest, the Reverend Joseph Siddons, he went to Weld's home and saw the dead boy's father walking near the house. The 2 men left their carriage and walked toward James Weld. As they approached, Weld said, "You need not say one word, gentlemen. I know my son is dead." Then he told a strange story. The previous afternoon he had been walking with his daughter along a lane near his house when he suddenly saw his son Philip. The boy was standing on the opposite side of the road between 2 men dressed in crimson robes. The daughter exclaimed, "Look, have you ever seen anyone looking so much like Philip?" Her father replied, "It must be him, it can be no one else." They noticed as they hurried toward the group that Philip was laughing and talking to the smaller of his companions. Suddenly, all 3 vanished. James Weld, certain that the vision signified some impending disaster, went directly home. When the mail arrived, he scanned it with dread, expecting some bad news of his son. But there were only the usual bills and invitations. "But when I saw you in a carriage outside my gate, I knew without doubt what you had come to tell me." Dr. Cox asked Mr. Weld if he had ever seen the men in the crimson robes before. He said that he had not, but the faces were so indelibly impressed on his mind that he would instantly know them again. Dr. Cox then told Mr. Weld of the circumstances of Philip's death, which took place at the very time the vision had appeared. At the funeral, the father scrutinized all the people who came to pay their last respects to Philip, but the men in the crimson robes were not among them. Months passed, and James Weld took his family on vacation in Lancashire. One Sunday, after attending the evening service at the local church, James Weld called on the local priest, Father Charles Raby. As he waited in the parlor, Weld glanced at the framed portraits on the wall. One, unnamed, pulled him up with a start. The features, the set of the jaw, the shape of the head, he had seen them all before. He knew them as well as he knew his own face. It was the man who had been at his son's side the day he saw him in the lane. He asked Father Raby about the portrait. He was told it was of Saint Stanislaus, a Jesuit saint, the patron saint of drowning men.